Today on Accelerating Education, are we thinking in magenta? I want you to take a moment to imagine your favorite color in your head. Got it? If you couldn't use that color's name, how would you define that color to another person? Would you use common objects, like the color of a stop sign, or the color of the ocean? How would you describe it to someone who has been blind since birth? Colette, what is the color red?
Red!
What is it?
I don't know. What is it? I don't know what it is.
Paxton, what is the color blue?
It is a dark, aqua-ish color.
Now, what if I asked you to describe it in a more scientific manner? You see, at the high school level, some of my students would start to describe properties of light, such as its wavelength. Personally, my favorite color is magenta. If you tried to scientifically describe magenta by its wavelength, though, you would quickly run into a problem. You see, magenta isn't a wavelength of light. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, hold on, I've seen a color wheel, and it's right there between red and blue. If you take a moment to think about the electromagnetic spectrum, you know, that spectrum that contains radio waves, infrared rays, ultraviolet, X-rays, and visible light, you might recall that red is on one end of the spectrum with large wavelengths, and it progresses to bluish-violet on the other end with shorter wavelengths. If the wavelength continues to shorten beyond that bluish-violet, or lengthens beyond red, we can't see it any longer. It's no longer in the visible part of the spectrum. At no point on that spectrum does blue directly connect to red, though. I'm not trying to say that magenta doesn't exist. It does, but not as a frequency of light. It exists completely in our minds. Magenta is the combination of red and blue wavelengths of light, but our minds don't perceive it as two colors. The brain creates a color that doesn't exist as light to fill in the gaps. Our need for maintaining a consistent understanding of the world is so strong that our brains will literally make up stuff just to keep everything moving along. I think that magenta is a beautiful analogy for our cognitive biases. We have so many cognitive biases. You're probably already familiar with several different kinds of cognitive biases, but just to make sure we're on the same page, let me talk about a couple of them. So, we have confirmation bias, which is the tendency to search for information that supports what your own beliefs are about something. There's also the framing effect, which causes people to come to different conclusions from a set of information based upon how that information is presented. We also have the anchoring effect, where people will rely too heavily on just one idea, typically the first piece of information that was presented, and the most commonly known one, the bandwagon effect, whereas because many other people believe that one idea, it must be right for you to believe that same idea as well. On the whole, many of these biases are actually useful tools. They are heuristics for just getting by in our day-to-day activities. Think about it. If we had to analyze every bit of data that our brains take in to make a decision, we would be quickly overwhelmed by just the sheer vastness of the amount of information. Now, at this point, you might start to think that this analogy is breaking down. Seeing magenta is rather insignificant when compared to dealing with cognitive biases. Additionally, we can never not see magenta. but we can work on our cognitive biases, right? I contend that this analogy is stronger than we realize. For those of us with typical color vision, it's true that we can never not see magenta. This is likely true of our biases as well. And, as I mentioned before, that serves us well in matters that are trivial. But what about when it does matter? If I were trying to build a color sensor that would detect the presence of magenta in an image, and I lacked that knowledge about color, building an effective sensor would be practically impossible. The same is true of our cognitive biases, and the only way to find them is to study them and start to recognize their role in our lives, especially when the consequences for failing to recognize them are high. It becomes all the more important to remember that what we think of first, or what we perceive, like seeing magenta, may not be grounded in reality.